So today we're talking about Puritan poetry, which at one point used to be regarded as if it were something of an oxymoron. How could the Puritans actually produce poetry? Since they seemed to be hostile to imaginative literature at any time, of any kind. Puritan theologians used to warn that the senses were unreliable, right? It's that whole total depravity thing. If the world is totally depraved, then anything of the world is unreliable at best and damned to hell at worst. And that would include most uses of human language. So I have to understand that. The Puritan poet has a particular problem. And this is going to be true of all three of the ones that we're going to look at today, and I think especially true of Edward Taylor, which is this. How do you represent something divine when the tools that you have are human? How can you represent the incommensurability of the divine mind, the extent to which it is so different from the human mind, when all that you have is human tools, right? Which again are unreliable at best and maybe worse, right? Damned at worst. So that's one of the problems that the Puritan poet has as a kind of technical problem. Figurative language, the Puritans distrust. They distrust graven images of any kind, right? I mean, they are very much opposed to both the Catholics and the Anglicans' use of what they consider to be graven images, their emphasis on speaking eloquently at the pulpit as a way of appealing to their parishioners, the use of music and vestments in Anglican and Catholic rituals. The Puritans are distrustful of all of this, and then they don't do it. In fact, in England, the Puritans become iconoclastic destroyers of religious imagery, especially during the Civil War, right? So they're really opposed to various kinds of representation. And so Puritan doctrines were generally thought to have forbidden any kind of figurative language, except when you're using it for the purpose of religious instruction. So this would seem to be a formidable set of obstacles, you might say, to the production of anything that we might call Puritan art or Puritan poetry. And there's an early statement in New England of what people have taken to be kind of principles of the Puritan use of language. And it comes from something that's called the Bay Psalm Book, which I'll show you in just a minute. But I want to show you where that fits in, right? So that's going to be 1640, the Bay Psalm Book. And this is, roughly speaking, the chronology that we're working with over the last couple of times, right? The Bradstreet and Dudley families arrived with Winthrop in 1630. 1630 is also the time when Bradford is writing the history of Plymouth Plantation, their plantation having been there for 10 years already. Hutchinson emigrates 4 years later. She's tried 4 years after that and banished the following year. 1648, that Cambridge platform, right, in which part of the problem that Hutchinson's antinomian controversy produces is the problem of how do we know when people have been converted. This idea that conversion should be personal on the one hand, the way that Hutchinson would approve, but also public, that you need to make a public profession of your faith. Right? So that's some of the stuff that we've been talking about. Bradstreet is writing poetry during these years, and she publishes her first volume there. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we are thinking about for the second half of the day. The Wigglesworth's Day of Doom is roughly contemporary with Paradise Lost, and also just before the beginning of King Philip's War, right, and the development of, you might say, the jeremiad by this time. And you might say that the jeremiad develops in 1670, but in some sense, the form is already being pioneered in not only sermons, but even in a poem like The Day of Doom, which, as we'll see, has certain jeremiadic kinds of structures and sensibilities behind it. So this is roughly the chronology that we're talking about, and what I'm trying to do in making this chronology is show you how the poetic productions that we'll be talking about today map onto the things that we've been talking about in the past week, that literature of settlement, and then Winthrop's Puritan City on the Hill and Rowlandson's narrative. So you might say this week is poetry for today, and then prose is what we are mapping it onto. This will be on the post-lecture notes. Now, the Bay Psalm Book was a translation of Psalms done in Massachusetts Bay. Its full title was The Whole Book of Psalms Faithfully Translated into English Meter, and it's that faithfully That is the important term there. They had inherited, they had brought with them a version of the Psalms that had been used in the Anglican Church, and various clergy in New England began to think of that as overly poetic, too figurative, not literal enough. And in fact, the preface is written by John Cotton, who's a very conservative minister who had ties to Hutchinson originally, and was one of the more conservative ministers in New England at the time. And his point of departure, the preface that he writes, is almost a little sermon, I suppose. It certainly takes as a point of departure a particular text from the Bible, and that text is this one in Exodus 20. The Lord says, "An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it," right? Just the stone. Don't chisel it. Leave it alone. That's enough. And this was taken metaphorically when Cotton does his introduction that is a kind of gloss on this. It's the idea that all you need is the Bible, faithfully rendered. You don't have to make it, more fanciful or figurative or easier to read. In that sense, there's a way in which you're polluting it, right? So this is what Cotton says. Never let any think that for the meter's sake we have taken liberty or poetical license to depart from the true and proper sense of David's words in the Hebrew verses. No, but it has been one part of our religious care and faithful endeavor to keep close to the original text. Now, when you're looking at something like this from the self-conscious point of view that I've been encouraging, you might want to look at, first of all, what assumptions lie beneath a piece of text like this, and then also what kind of relations it sets up. What's good? What's bad? Of what does it disapprove? Of what does it approve? Right? If you go back to the piece that we had you read from Stephen Greenblatt, that idea of culture, he talks about poems of praise and blame. And he says, when you're looking at these kind of extreme forms of poetry, poems of praise and blame, you can quite clearly see how certain ideological points of view work their way in. The poet is trying to praise someone, you can see a certain set of ideological assumptions at play. Blame, the same thing. It's easier to see. Then he says, look for those structures in everything that you read, right? So what is being praised and what is being blamed here, just in this little snippet of text? Anybody? The meanings aren't hidden. They're just kind of right there. What's being praised? Yeah? Ordinariness. Okay, ordinariness. What word would you use to say ordinariness? What? Unembellished. Okay, good. Unembellished. Where is unembellished? No, word from this. Like if you're saying, okay, fine, the concept is ordinariness, so we need to pull our data from the actual text. What word suggests ordinariness? Okay, so ordinariness suggests not for the meter's sake have we taken liberty or poetical license. So what's being praised and what's being blamed? If ordinary is being praised, what's being blamed? Yeah. Yeah, sure, poetical license. And not only poetical license, look at it's or poetical license, but liberty. We haven't taken liberties with the text. Just think about that phrase, take liberties with the text. Somehow that's departing from what is ordinary. It's set up, you might say, against the idea of being faithful. If you're faithful to something, you don't take liberties with it. And yet, liberty means what? I mean, liberty means freedom, right? So there's a certain sense in which there is a kind of constraint, a self-imposed constraint that's being built into this. And you might say that's part of Puritan ideology. Puritan ideology is about imposing constraints on yourself because you believe that that's what, the way that you should follow God's will. He goes on, if therefore the verses are not always so smooth and elegant as some may desire or expect, let them consider that God's altar needs not our polishings, right? That's Exodus 20 that I showed you. This is how he glosses it. God's altar needs not our polishings. For we have respected rather a plain translation. And see, that would be good for your ordinary point, right? So if you're going to say, he's talking about the importance of ordinary language, plain translation. Remember I told you when we were talking about Bradford, that Bradford and other Puritans were thought to have written in a plain style. And I suggested to you that's kind of a misreading of what they're doing. In a certain way, the diction may be plain enough, but it's built, as I hoped you saw, on a whole set of ideological assumptions and a symbolic structure about the old world versus the new world, the Old Testament versus the New Testament, who is the chosen people, who isn't the chosen people. And Bradford's 9th chapter is that strange little performance when he stops, addresses himself to some reader, brings in the Indians, breaks chronology, compares himself to the apostles, right? It's a very complicated piece of rhetoric, not plain at all. And yet, critics who believed that it was plain back in the day used to take their cue from this. We have respected rather a plain translation than to smooth our verses with the sweetness of any paraphrase. And so have attended conscience rather than elegance, fidelity rather than poetry, right? That's why I'm suggesting to you that Puritan poetry was often regarded as if it were an oxymoron, right? Because it would seem that this whole idea of faithfulness is in direct opposition to some category that we would label poetry. So we want not poetry, which somehow seems to be false, fictitious, fidelity in translating the Hebrew words into English language and David's poetry into English meter. I mean, there's a kind of weird slippage here, right? I mean, the Bible is, that portion of the Bible is poetry, the Psalms, and yet the Puritans are suspicious of poetry, and yet there's poetry in the Bible. What are we going to do about that? Well, we'll make it yucky to read. That'll make it better, right? Or truer. That so we may sing and sigh on the Lord's song of praise according to his own will until he take us from hence and wipe away all our tears and bid us enter into our Master's joy to sing eternal hallelujahs. Amen, right? That sounds like a sermon, and yet it's an introduction to this book of the Bible. Right? So one of the things we need to see is that this, in certain senses, is the horizon of expectations against which poets like Wigglesworth, Bradstreet, and Taylor are writing. This is what their audience is expecting to read. Poetry as almost a kind of necessary evil that's tolerable only when it's in the service of religious instruction. So when people nowadays say that Anne Bradstreet is interesting to us, it's precisely because they're interested in the way that she is in some sense rebelling against this. They portray her as a kind of cultural rebel who is rebelling not only against the formal strictures against smooth verses and sweetness and poetry and paraphrase, but also against the very narrow role that the Puritans construct for women. Right? Likewise, Edward Taylor is portrayed as somebody who isn't part, in some sense, of mainstream Puritan culture. He's living, for the most part, out in the sticks, and he's engaged in sort of theological disputes, but they're mostly in his head and through his writing. And he, in some sense, is a kind of outlier from mainstream the Puritan society. There's a sense in which Taylor kind of knew that he was doing something that might not be regarded as strictly speaking doctrinaire. Therefore, he never published his poetry. It remained unpublished, almost lost, actually, although he carefully preserved it. It's like he carefully preserved it in these bound volumes that he handed down to his family. I think they were eventually discovered in an attic someplace and given to the Yale Library in 1920. So Taylor was not well known in literary circles until the 20th century. Right? So there's a sense in which you might say the conditions, the context in which these two poets, especially Bradstreet and Taylor, lived, had everything to do, according to this train of scholarly thinking, with the fact that they could produce the poetry they did. Bradstreet had a more liberal father and husband who believed that women should be educated. Back in England, she was able to read through the English poetic tradition with her father. She was relatively well-to-do. She had servants. She didn't have to spend all of her time raising the children and doing housekeeping, on the one hand. And Taylor, off in the sticks, able to pursue a kind of quiet life of contemplation, he also was able to write these poems, right? And there's a sense in which, from the standpoint of what we're thinking about today, we're going to use Michael Wigglesworth as kind of the control group for us. So you might say that the kind of poetry we would expect to be produced, if this is what our idea of poetry is, Cotton's strictures about poetry, if that's going to be the plan for producing poetry, probably it's going to look something like Wigglesworth. And then we'll look at the other two as potentially departures. And again, I wanted to stress to you the idea of the jeremiad. It starts as, by the time Danforth gives his sermon, Errand into the Wilderness in 1670, the jeremiad is already a kind of settled sermonic form. But the logic behind the jeremiad has been there from the beginning. We are the chosen people. We did something wrong. just as Adam did something wrong. Adam has to pay for that. He has to be tested. We often will have to be tested. In the end, because God is merciful, he redeems Adam's progeny through the agency of Christ. In the end, he will redeem us. We're certain of that. So no matter how bad things are, if we just, abide by the straight and go back to the original zeal of the founders, that will be a sign. If we have an inclination to do this, it will be a sign that somehow God is still paying attention to us. Remember that moment from Rowlandson. The worst thing she can imagine is not that she should go to hell. It's that God doesn't care about her, that he's just forgotten about her. So there's a sense within the jeremiad that even if you're listening time after time to the preacher telling you about how sinful you are and how we've made this garden of the new world has become overgrown with weeds and blah, 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 it's a howling wilderness again. Nevertheless, it convinces us that all of this punishment is taking place precisely because God is disappointed, precisely because he cares, because God has chosen the Puritans to be the chosen people, right? That structure goes along with Wigglesworth as well. And it's interesting to note, again, that Wigglesworth is 1662, John Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost. How many of you have read Paradise Lost in the context of some course here? Okay, so you know a little bit about Paradise Lost. 1667, roughly the same topic. Paradise Lost and then Regained is basically the thing that both of them are interested in. But Milton looks a little bit different, we would say, from Wigglesworth. Let's take a look at Wigglesworth. This is on page, let's take a look at the beginning of Wigglesworth on page, sorry, I've lost my page. Let's just go to the very beginning, 218. Could somebody read the first stanza for me of Wigglesworth? Yes, go ahead. Loudly and with conviction.
Still was the night, serene and bright, when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal reason thought so it would last for aye. Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease. Much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among the evening before.
Okay, good. Interestingly, you didn't read the stuff in the margin. It's an interesting question about how you're supposed to, what relation the stuff in the margin has to the stuff that you just read. Most people would not bother with the stuff in the margin. All right, now read that, please.
Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree of mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden to one greater man, restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire, that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning, how the heavens and earth arose out of chaos, or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed, fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted, yet in prose or rhyme.
Thank you. Come on, give him a hand. They're a little bit different, right? Okay, so let's comment a little bit. Let's start with this one. Because in a funny way, this is more familiar to us as a piece of like great lit that we study in survey courses. What do we notice about it? Or what have you been told about it? These are just the first few lines of book 1 from Milton. But as I said, the beginning of any, it begins with all kinds of prose prefaces and stuff like that. But when you look at this, there are certain ground rules that Milton is immediately establishing. Certain things he's invoking, certain styles he's invoking. So if we were going to look at this as a piece of text, we would start to catalog our data. Nothing is too insignificant to be written down in our catalog, because we may not use it or we may use it. So, something we notice about this? Anything? Yes? Okay, that's good. It has a lot more details. We don't even need to think about it in terms of Wigglesworth right now. So there are details. Would you point to any particular details that seem interesting to you? Okay, so one kind of details are particular proper names. right? Places in the Bible, right? That good? What about this phrase just above the one you pointed to? Sing, heavenly muse. Anybody do anything with that? Yeah. Okay, it belongs not to the same tradition, you might say, as Oreb or Sinai, but the tradition of Greek. Greek what? Anybody? Greek epic, yes. You were going to say? Okay, so it's written in, what does it mean when there's no blank? All right, there you go. What does it mean when it's not written in rhyme? Okay, but what meter is it generally in if it's blank verse? Yes. Yeah, so it's pretty much iambic pentameter. I'm trying to find a good line. Brought death into the world and all our woe, right? 5 feet, Right, that's the standard English meter in English for poetry, iambic pentameter. When you don't write in iambic pentameter, you're usually doing something for effect. So this is written in iambic pentameter. Since it's unrhymed, we call it blank verse. Very good. So we've got unrhymed iambic pentameter. Doesn't look to be, it doesn't look like it's in stanzas. We've got proper names drawn from the biblical tradition. Also a kind of invocation of Greek epic, right? The very beginning of epic is sing. Beginning of Virgil's Aeneid. I sing of arms in the men, arma virumque cano, right? So he's invoking that whole tradition. And there are even uses of words like chaos that might be compatible with Greek epic, even though one of the things we would say is he's revising that tradition. It's a heavenly muse that's going to be linked directly to the Christian conception of God. Anything else we want to note here? How about the lines? Anything to note about the lines? Where they begin and end, maybe? Oh, very good. They are enjambed, yes. So that means what?
It's not the end of the sentence, the end of the line continues into the next line.
Good. So you would say that, if a line is strongly end-stopped, we would say the grammatical sense of it would end at the end of the line. So you'd have a comma there, the clause would be complete, or something not this. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit, and to find out the fruit of what, we have to continue on. Of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, stop there. So when you notice, so part of what your job is going to be, like if enjambment were going to be one of the things that you were looking for on your scavenger hunt, you'd say, okay, that's enjambment, you'd give us an example of it, and then you'd say what the effect is. So you try to think about what the effect of this is. And there could be any number of things that you might think about it, right? You might say that he kind of puts you on the hook here, and he asks you to keep thinking of this, all the more to emphasize this, our woe. That's where you get the stop. Anyway, anything else to notice about this? Okay, so when you have an enjambment like this, you usually have something else emphasized in the middle of the line. What would that be called? Caesura, right? Almost every line has a kind of natural caesura, and it's not the same as in Latin when there always is a caesura. But generally speaking, if you find an enjambment, you're going to be finding a caesura beforehand. So then you think about how those two work together. What does the caesura emphasize? Of man's first disobedience, boom. And the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. No caesura there. So again, you would think about what do you think the effects are. And it's going to be interpretive, right? You're trying to think about, if this were a passage, you'd say, well, what is the overall effect? The last thing the poet says here in this passage is, it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Well, is that true? What's going to be unattempted? Is this a standard kind of style? Or is he using a kind of standard style, but within the constraints that are imposed by blank verse, is he doing interesting things with the enjambments and caesura? What is it? Or is it maybe the project of Christian epic? Maybe that's what's not been attempted. Right? So these are some of the things you'd want to... And if that's what it is, how does the diction, the words that he's chosen, and the ways in which he's put them down, the syntax, how do they help him right away to signal that something new under the sun is coming in prose or rhyme? Okay? just a little snippet of Paradise Lost. It's one way to go about telling this in 10 and then 12 books of epic, right? Big. As opposed to this. And I should probably have put it up here, but take a look at it again. Still was the night, serene and bright, when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal reason thought so 'twould last for aye. Soul, take ease, take thine ease, let sorrow cease. Much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among the evening before. Okay, look at that, look at that. Now let's talk about the differences. What do we see in Wigglesworth's poem? Yes?
There's little need for interpretation, or there's no possible interpretation besides the one. He's telling you exactly what you need to know.
Yeah, so you would say, you mean interpretation by us?
Yes.
So it's much clearer than this, perhaps? I mean, it seems to be more. Now, why would you say that? Just the words?
I mean, it's hard to think of it without comparing it to the Milton, but
Well, if you compare to Milton, you do see some of the things that we notice for some of those details are not there. There are no proper names invoked. There's no epic tradition being invoked. It's all, there's the one, there's no proper nouns at all, actually. So that's one thing you might say. But in terms of fixing interpretation, if you're the reader, what is also helping to fix interpretation? Yeah?
The sing-song nature of it makes it very easy to in the introduction they talk about how since it was written in this sort of rhyming style, it's easy for people to learn.
Okay, so it has, as opposed to this, which is kind of dense blank verse, it has a rhyming style. Wallowing in all kind of sin, vile wretches lay secure. The best of men had scarcely then their lamps kept in good yore. Virgins and wise who through disguise amongst the best were numbered, had closed their eyes, yea, and the wise through sloth and frailty slumbered. Well, when you put it that way, right? Okay, and people in the introduction, I think they talk about, it's supposed to be an aid to memorization. You keep it in this kind of simple way. Okay, so what is that telling us then? Let's do a little bit more with that. First, let's talk about the rhyming scheme. What is the rhyming scheme? Look at the first couple, 3 verses. Like as of old, when men grow bold, God's threatenings to condemn, who stopped their ear and would not hear when mercy warned them. A, B, where's the A and where's the B? Look at verse 3. Like as of old, when men grow bold, God's threatenings to condemn, when stopped their ear and would not hear, when mercy warned them. Yeah?
AA, B, C.
Okay, and the AA is typically when we say that we're talking about the lines, right? But in fact, there's an internal rhyme here. So it's AA in the first line, and then a B, then C, C, and then the B. So it's A1, A2, maybe B, then C1, C2, and then the B again. And then the second half of the stanza works the same. Okay, that's good. Seems fairly regular. He does it most of the time. So the internal rhyme helps with the sing-song nature of it. What else helps with the sing-song nature of it? How long are these lines? Anybody? What's that? Iambic tetrameter, which means how many feet? 4 feet. Show me. Pick any one.
Like as of old when men grow bold.
Okay, like as of old when men grow bold. That's iambic tetrameter. Next line.
God's threat means to condemn. So trimeter.
Right. Good. So it's tetrameter, 4 iambic feet, trimeter, 3 iambic feet, 8 beats in the first line, 6 beats in the second line. These are called 14ers because there are 14 beats between the two. It's a kind of ballad rhythm, and it exactly does that. It has that kind of sing-song sort of pace. The shortened line makes it easier to remember, but also when you're trying to account for, so it has a kind of sing-song quality, or it seems plain, or it seems simpler than that, right? Each line is shorter. Plus you combine that with the rhymes, that's how he creates that particular effect. Okay, so that's one thing to notice about this. That's it. You might say it gives at least the illusion of plainness and simplicity, although I think you would say that if you're actually trying to write these damn things, it's a little bit, you have to work on it to get that internal rhyme to work all the time. You've got a lot of stuff going on there, actually. Anything else about fixing interpretation? Yeah?
Well, it directs you to the Bible verse that you're meant to.
Okay, good. So each one of these verses, you might say, is then presented to us as a kind of gloss on something in the Bible, or a dramatization of it. So each verse here, or each stanza, doesn't have to rely on its own authority. It relies on the authority of something else. We might call the stuff that's in the margin a paratext, a text that sits side by side. So one of the things to say about this is this poem is clearly intertextual. In a similar way to the way that something like Bradford or something like Winthrop is intertextual, right? It refers you back to some other text, without which the meaning of this wouldn't make sense. That other text completes the meaning of this poem. And not the other way around, actually. And that other text is the Bible. Okay, so that's one of the things just to bear in mind about how this works. It's thought to have been something that was written primarily for instruction for children. And if you look at it, it follows that kind of jeremiadic structure, right? All of a sudden, boom, the day of doom is going to come, and there's going to be a whole lot of suffering and stuff going on. And if you look, I think this is not even the whole poem. They have nicely excerpted it for you. But if you look at the very end, so this is page 233. Verse 218, thus shall they lie and wail and cry, tormented and tormenting, their galled hearts with poisoned darts, but now too late repenting. There let them dwell in the flames of hell, there leave we them to burn, and back again unto the men whom Christ acquits return. And then we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 verses about how nice it is for those men who are acquitted. The last couple of verses. For God above in arms of love doth dearly them embrace, and fills their sprites with such delights and pleasures in his grace, as shall not fail nor yet grow stale through frequency of use, nor do they fear God's favor there to forfeit by abuse. That's a doctrine. Nor do they fear God's favor there to forfeit by abuse. What is it?
No good works can...
Not exactly. I think that's in here someplace. This pretty much, all of those principles are in here someplace, but that particular one, nor do they fear God's favor there to forfeit by abuse. You can't forfeit God's favor by abuse there because... Right, perseverance of the saints, right? Once you got it, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't mean you're supposed to go abusing it up there. Of course, you're a saint. You wouldn't want to, right? For there the saints are perfect saints, and holy ones indeed. From all the sin that dwelt within, their mortal bodies freed, made kings and priests to God through Christ your love's transcendency, there to remain and there to reign with him eternally. How many verses? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 verses about how nice it is in heaven. And really it's not. It's kind of 6 and 2 lines. And 217 3/4 verses devoted to hellfire and damnation. That's what people remember about the day of doom, right? It's all these vivid images of hell. Take a look, for example. Let's pick one. I don't know. How about 17? This is on page 222. Before his throne a trump is blown, proclaiming the day of doom. Forthwith he cries, ye dead arise, and unto judgment come. No sooner said, but 'tis obeyed, sepulchres opened are. Dead bodies all rise at his call, and mighty's power declare. It's kind of like a zombie thing, right? Cool. Or, I don't know, let's take a little... Oh, this is even better. Especially when you think about the audience for this being children. Yeah. How about on page 231, 199? Or go back to 198, about husbands and wives and then children's. He that was erst a husband pierced with sense of wife's distress, whose tender heart did bear a part of all her grievances, shall mourn no more as heretofore because of her ill plight, although he see her now to be a damned forsaken wight. The tender mother will own no other of all her numerous brood, but such as stand in Christ's right hand, acquitted through his blood. The pious father had now much rather his graceless son should lie in hell with devils for all his evils, burning eternally. Then God most high should injury by sparing him sustain. You'll see there's an enjambment across stanzas there, right? And doth rejoice to hear God's voice adjudging him to pain, who having all, both great and small, convinced and silenced, did then proceed their doom to read, and thus it uttered, and then all the stuff that he's going to say. What did that just say? We'd rather send our children to hell than have them, and we're happy about it, rather than they should be up there sullying God's grace if they are not redeemed. You're going to toss your, well, every now and then I feel like doing the same thing to my kids, but most of the time, that would be painful. Your kids, I mean, how unregenerate can they be? Well, I don't know. I guess, if they haven't been converted yet and the day of doom comes along and oopsie daisy, just didn't make it in time. Or maybe they were never meant to make it in time. Anyway, we throw them into the flaming lake. Done with them. So you might see that one of the things that this does, if you're a child, is it kind of puts the fear of God into you quite literally. I mean, I often liken it to a movie like, I don't know, what would be a movie that does this? Anybody ever seen Brian De Palma's Scarface? Or anything like Brian De Palma's Scarface? I mean, we have 2 and some hours of unmitigated violence of all kinds, including right? Cutting arms off with a power saw. And then at the end, of course, he's a drug dealer and a bad guy, and he comes to no good, and he gets killed. And you could say at the end, look, violence doesn't pay, being a bad guy doesn't pay, everybody gets their comeuppance at the end, right? Officially, that's the moral of a story. Except that you've been watching it for 2 hours, and probably, if you're certain kind, let's just say that when this first came out, certain friends of mine were quite taken with this movie, saw it several times, and started spending all their time talking like Tony Montana, Al Pacino's drug-dealing Cuban, hey, man, don't fuck with me, man, come on, man. I'll fucking fuck you up. And so you're enjoying that for 2 hours, and then you get to say, oh, but of course he was a bad guy, and he gets what he deserves at the end. See what I'm saying? There's a certain way in which that moral somehow seems perhaps a little insufficient, given what you've witnessed. I would say that same thing here. 217 plus verses devoted to hellfire and damnation, and 6 and change devoted to, why, God's grace. Of course you have a sort of doctrinaire ending, and yet for the most part, the way the poem works is to put exactly that kind of fear of hellfire and damnation into you. So there's a sense in which Wigglesworth has his cake and eat it too, just as De Palma does in that movie, or any movie that's kind of like that, where the bad guys get their own at the end, and yet we've been kind of following with probably more interest than we should their careers during the course of it. And I think that's one of the things to understand about the jeremiadic structure. I mean, there's a sense in which you might say it can backfire. There are problems with this. And this will come up next time when Jonathan Edwards, who is paradoxically remembered most perhaps today for one sermon that he preached that you'll read called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that uses this strategy. For the most part, he's very suspicious of this strategy. He doesn't want people to be, scared into obedience. He wants you to embrace obedience. He wants you, you might say, to really take to heart those last 6 verses and not be so swayed by the first 217 or so. And I think that's also the true of Edward Taylor, the poet. One of the things that Taylor does when he's thinking about regeneration and the act of receiving grace is he fundamentally is more interested in grace itself than he is in hellfire and damnation. There's a funny way in which Wigglesworth's poem has more of a kind of tragic sensibility about it, and there's a fundamentally comic sensibility that animates Taylor, as we'll see. All right, are there questions about this? I hope you've seen just some of the ways in which this poem works. It has certain tricks that it uses. And among these tricks are some that have to do with the actual words that he chooses, the way the rhyme schemes are set up, and then there's just the larger structure of the poem, which again we might say follows this kind of jeremiadic structure. Blame, 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 saved. Okay. Any thoughts, any questions about that? All right. With Bradstreet, we get something really different. I mean, there's a certain way in which Bradstreet is a little bit more like Milton in terms of the ways in which she makes use of more traditional verse forms. And this is a nice stained glass window representation of her. I don't know the year of this. I actually have to find out in England. We'll keep that up for a little bit. So one of the things, again, we would say about Bradstreet is that she's different. She comes from she's one of the, she comes from a very prominent family. She, again, is part of Winthrop's group in 1630. And there's a sense in which she, even as she's writing, there's a kind of loosening up of strictures about poetry, right? So she comes knowing the English tradition, in part through her father, who maintained a large library in England. And by 1650, which is about 10 years after the Bay Psalm book and the year that her first collection of poems is published, there's already a kind of shift evident in Puritan attitudes towards writing. Increasingly, Puritan writers felt licensed, you might say, to use what we might think of as worldly or even sensual imagery, so long as that was in the service of religious purposes. So there was another translation of the Bay Psalm book. It was revised again. This time it was 1651 by President Henry Dunster of Harvard and by Richard Lyon, who was a minister. And they claim to have had a special eye for the sweetness of the verse, right? So what goes around comes around. We're back to thinking again about the need to think about capturing the sweetness of the verse of David's poetry. And in fact, Cotton Mather later said that it was thought that a little more art was to be employed upon the verses than in the previous translation of the Bay Psalm book. Right? So this book was published in London in that year in 1650, and it remains the first still existing book of poetry, and we think still the first one to be published by an inhabitant of the Americas. And Bradstreet was born in England, precisely in here in Lancashire, and she was educated by her father, who was the steward to an earl, the Earl of Lincoln. He was a devout Puritan, but he didn't seem to see any distinction or any contradiction between having strong religious convictions and also advocating that women like his daughter should be educated. And again, that was a kind of more liberal perspective among the Puritans. So she marries her assistant, and her father's assistant, Simon Bradstreet, and they both emigrate to America. She is shocked by how difficult it is to emigrate to America. And there's I was kind of making fun, I think, of Reagan's, turning Winthrop into a rugged individualist and saying, little wooden boat and early freedom man. But it is true that they went through very difficult conditions. In fact, Bradstreet has a diary, some of which still remains, and she writes in the diary about missing some of the comforts of England and how she resisted the kind of new customs and manners of America. But eventually the two families, the Bradstreets and the Dudleys, do become very successful, and they settle down in Andover. She has, 8 children between 1633 and 1652, and I think some miscarriages in there as well. And she's responsible for educating them, for running the household, but she is wealthy enough to afford servants. So she's able to do this writing. First kid is 1633. First known poem that she composes is about 1632 when she's 19. And in 1645, she collects her poetry in a private, informal volume that she dedicates to her father. And her early poetry is less interesting to us. It's generally more formulaic, more dutiful, more along those kind of didactic lines that are prescribed by something like the preface to the Bay Psalm book. But eventually she starts writing about other themes. And finally, her brother-in-law takes her poems without her permission, brings them to England, and they're brought out in 1650 without her knowledge, although they're very well received when they come out there. So one of the things we might think about then is what it means to be someone in this position, to be Bradstreet, to be writing poems, and then later on to find out that they've been published. Let's take a look on at the very beginning of the Bradstreet section. I think it's page 190. And let's do 188. Look at the prologue. And again, this might help us for a minute. It's a little bit long, but it's actually, I think it makes sense to read the whole thing out loud. Somebody be brave and read the whole thing out loud. No one brave here? Okay. The whole thing. The whole prologue, all 8 stanzas. Loudly and with feeling. Ready? Go.
To sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun. For my mean pen are 2 superior things, or how they all or each their dates have run. Let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim the worth. But when my wondering eyes and envious heart, great Bardus' sugared lines do but read o'er, fool I do grudge the muses did not part, twixt him and me that overfluent store. A Bardus can do what a Bardus will, but simple I according to my skill. From schoolboy's tongue no rhetoric we expect, nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings, nor perfect beauty wears a main defect. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings. And this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable. Nor can I, like that fluent, sweet-tongued Greek, who lisped at first, in future times speak plain. By art he gladly found what he did seek, a full requital of his striving pain. Art can do much, but this maxim's most sure, a weak or wounded brain admits no cure. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue, who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. But sure the antique Greeks were far more mild, else of our sex, why feigned they those 9, and poesy made Calliope's own child. So amongst the rest they placed the arts divine. But this weak knot they will full soon untie. The Greeks did not, but play the fools and lie. Let Greeks be Greeks, and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. And O ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your praise still catch your praise, if e'er you deign those lowly lines your eyes, give thyme or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine.
Thank you. That was very good. All righty. What do we notice about it? Yes.
Well, first thing we notice is another use of Greeks and muses. And
Okay.
talking about that and how
Excellent. First stanza, Greeks, muses, and even into the later stanzas. How is she talking about it? Yeah.
in terms of art and in terms of the way they create art and kind of referencing it back to herself.
Okay. More. Push it one more. What is her relation to that old Greek tradition that she's invoking? To sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, from my mean pen are 2 superior things, or how they all or each their dates have run. Let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth.
It's kind of setting herself below that, saying, okay, they've done this, I'm just merely
Exactly.
on the lower level.
My mean pen. And look at the categories. Again, we're looking at the systems of value, what she praises and what she blames. She's praising the men. They belong to 2 categories. They are poets and historians. So if they're poets and historians, what is she? Is she not a poet? Right? There's a kind of weird category thing going on. But when my wondering eyes and envious heart, great Bardus, sugared lines, but read o'er, fool, I do grudge the muses did not part twixt him and me that overfluent store. A Bardus can do what a Bardus will, but simple I according to my skill. Right? So there's an immediately, what we would be saying, self-deprecatory tone. Right? She's presenting herself as almost a kind of supplicant. She's humble because she's a woman, right? Women are not supposed to do this. She's not supposed to be writing about seeing wars and captains, kings, and all that kind of stuff. And she's suggesting it's almost like a paralipsis at the beginning, right? All these things I'm not going to do. So she's setting out first what it is she's not going to do before she gets to what it is she is going to do. And look at the deprecation continue in the third stanza. From a schoolboy's tongue, no rhetoric we expect, right? Because they're too young, they're not educated. Nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings. Okay, if the instrument's broken, it's not going to make good music. Nor perfect beauty where remains effect. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so strings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, because nature made it so irreparable, right? Oh, I just don't have the tools, I don't have the talent, I'm kind of a housewife. Right, it's a setup for what she's trying to do. All right, just some of the formal stuff. What would we notice? Say, if you need to, in comparison to these lines, this invocation of the epic tradition, how is hers different? Yeah? It's also iambic pentameter. Good. Good. These are all things you should notice. So it ends with pretty much a heroic couplet. They're strongly end-stopped for the most part. Anything else? One of the things we might say about it is it's so standard that the form is not supposed to be an issue. And you might think of this as a strategy, right? Because look what she says later on. She says, I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says, my hand a needle better fits. What are you using a pen for? You're a woman, use a needle. So, that's what you're supposed to do, or cook. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong. For such despite they cast on female wits. Females aren't smart enough to do this. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. So then even if it's good, people will say, they'll say I stole it. Or, by accident, just a one-trick pony, you can't do it again, right? And then she makes another comparison. But think about, again, the way she's making comparisons to the way that people that we've seen, Bradford, Winthrop, even Rowlandson, are making comparisons. She's not comparing herself to the apostles here. She's going back to the antique Greeks. And she's even suggesting that those antique Greeks, presumably less enlightened than the Puritans, are much kinder to women than the Puritans are, right? Why feigned they those 9 in poesy made Calliope's own child? And one of the things to look at here is there's a certain way in which this, and in a poem that I'll ask you to look at in section this week, is a kind of rewrite of this that's called the preface. She writes it for her second volume. Think about the rhetoric of producing children that's at stake here, and then even more so in there, right? So one of the things you might see here early on is what will later on in the 19th century be called the separation of spheres. As if there is a sphere of men, and that is a sphere of, pick it, politics, economics, government, public life, and a sphere of women, and that has to do with private life, domesticity, religion, education. Obviously, religion is a bigger part of public life for men in this period than it will be then, perhaps. But that idea of a separation of spheres is something she ostensibly accepts. Men do this stuff, and they do it well. Women are not thought to do this, and whatever it is I'm doing, let's not call it poetry, let's not call it history, but whatever it is I'm doing, don't feel threatened by it, you men. I'm doing my own little thing here. I wish they'd given me more talent, but they didn't, so I'm doing my own little thing here. Let beaks speak weaks, and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel, it is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all, and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. And now she's being a little bit cunning, right? And oh, ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your praise still catch your praise, if e'er you deign these lowly lines your eyes. Give time or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. What does that mean? Who gets bay leaves? What's that? Yeah, poets, and when you won the tragic festival, you got the bay leaves. That was a sign of your achievement, right? She's not asking for that. Give me the herbs that suit my situation as a woman, and a housewife, and a mother, and a wife. Give me thyme, or give me parsley. And what I want you to see is this poem drips with irony, right? In the sense that what it is trying to convey is precisely the opposite of what it is saying. She's saying like, oh, I don't have any talent, and yet it's a very cunningly put together poem. She's saying, oh, you know, I can't really be a poet, and yet it absolutely follows various and sundry recognizable rules for the creation of poetry. There's no question that you would look at the form of this and say, if you were reading it in 1650, that's a poem. And depending on what you think, a pretty good poem. Give time or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. Kind of raw material you have polished. And yet, you might see that as a prologue to a set of poems, this idea of it as ore that can be refined is precisely what the poetic project is going to be. Right? So then, when you go back and look at the preface and see the way in which she rewrites this, I want you to realize that what that poem is actually about is precisely rewriting this. So keep an eye on that for section meetings on Friday. One of the things we would say about this then is that what Bradstreet is doing is trying to carve out a space for the practice of, she's not calling it poetry, but it is poetry by women within Puritan culture. She's registering awareness of the Greeks, right? She's showing that she's educated, but she's being suitably self-deprecatory. And one thing to say is that she, you know, feels in the same position that we saw Mary Rowlandson in, right? Mary Rowlandson needs to be licensed to speak. Quite literally, Increase Mather has to say, go and write this. And her husband has to say, it's okay. And to make sure that we all understand what it is we're reading, we put a foreword and an afterword to bracket her. And the title, Sovereignty of Goodness and God, Rowlandson is afterwards, right? She's hemmed in. And there's a certain way in which she is supposed to put her personal feelings, her own grief, her personal experience, submerged to the doctrinaire, read kind of masculine, authorized set of meanings. Bradstreet is working against those conventions as well. And so what we want to be looking for when we look at her poetry is the way in which she is, in fact, playing with some of these conventions. There's something teasing here. The ultimate, but you might say it's ironic precisely because it says, I'm humble, I have no talent, but really it's a demonstration that she does have talent, and perhaps she's not quite as humble as we think. If you look at her other poems that we had assigned, we will find that some of them seem to be very little about authorized Puritan subjects, especially the ones that are about her husband. Let's see. Let's take a look at To My Dear and Loving Husband on 206. And the one you'll do in section is Author to Her Book, which is on the previous page. To my dear and loving husband, if ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the earth doth hold, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. My love is such that rivers cannot quench. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love let's so persever, that when we live no more, we may live ever. Right? Nice little poem to her dear and loving husband. So where's the religious instruction in there? Anybody find it? Well, it does say heaven. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. What's the difference between heavens and heaven with a capital H? Are they the same? I don't know. One of them is a little more colloquial. One of them cuts. You'll see this later with Franklin. He has a way of using what look like religious words, but he cuts them down to size very cunningly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that also is there when she talks about debt. She says that love is such I can no way repay. And instead of referring to Christ,
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, you know, the doctrinaire kind of love, who's everybody's bridegroom? Christ, right? Christ is your real bridegroom. Earthly love is earthly, right? And we know about the earth. It's, say it with me, depraved and damned. So, earthly love, that includes the chaste love of the husband for the wife. That's damned too, apparently. Right? How does this square with that? Maybe this is it. That while we live in love, let's so persevere that when we live no more, we may live ever. Wait a minute. Is that right? You get to live forever because you were so loving when you were... one of the things I want you to see is that she's a far more complex and contradictory poet than we might say should have existed in Puritan American if Puritan American was such a monolith. So I want you to see that in some sense there is a way in which Bradstreet is extraordinary because she's a poet writing, a woman poet writing all these things. But you can see that maybe one of the things we should also think is that if we look at Bradstreet's poetry, we learn something else about the context in which she was writing. Maybe it's not all John Cotton-based songbook strictures. Maybe it's a little bit more open than we had thought, less monolithic. Again, that reciprocal relation from the Greenblatt essay between text and context. Right? So think about that. Think also perhaps about moments in some of the other poems. I'll just point to you the one on page 212, the verses upon the burning of our house. Ask yourself whether in the middle, so what you know, the house burns and she says, okay, but they're just earthly things, and so what's really important is what's up there in heaven. Fine. So ask yourself, is she convincing when she does that? Or is it maybe something like Rowlandson's poetry, whereby somehow real feeling and grief and affection is seeping through? What does she place emphasis on? What poetic devices does she use in the middle of that poem that would suggest it ain't quite so easy to part with the stuff as those Puritan ministers want you to think? Yeah. Right, I mean, that's the doctrinaire reason. That's it. It happened to me for a reason. It just teaches me that, again, I can't put store on earth. There's a line from Matthew that we'll encounter when we go back to Moby Dick. Lay not your treasures here on earth where moth and rust do corrupt, but lay thy treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not corrupt. Okay. It's supposed to be the meaning. And yet, read through it and see the experience of reading it. Is that the only thing the poem is conveying? Officially, yes, but yes.
No, I felt like there was like a compulsory initial reaction to the divine providence.
Mm-hmm.
And she slips into these lines.
Which ones?
But yet sufficient for us left. When by the ruins oft I pass, my sorrow and eyes aside did cast, and here and there the places spy where oft I sat and long did lie. And then it continues where she's just
Very good.
she's dwelling in what was lost.
Right? I mean, if you were really going to do it, you'd minimize what was there, but she just remembers the specific objects. Now, there's no way to read it. You could say that she still has to get over it. That's a sign of how difficult it is to get over that. But ask yourself about that. The extent of the specificity. Here stood that trunk, and near that chest, there lay the store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie, and them behold no more shall I. But then, okay, so if you say, all right, well, fine. But look at what she does next with the anaphora, right, with that repetition of the form at the beginning of the line. Nor at thy table eat a bit, no pleasant tale, nor things were counted, no candle air, nor bridegroom's voice shall air, right? I mean, there's a kind of emphasis there in the form which possibly belies what she's ostensibly officially saying. That's what I want you to think about when we think about the relationship between what they're saying, content or theme, and form. How does sometimes they don't actually always work in tandem or complementary. Sometimes conflict works its way in there, and that's part of the meaning of the poem. One thing I just want to point out again is the next poem, As Weary Pilgrim. It's written, we think it's the last poem she wrote. It's the last one that survives. It's 3 years after the previous, roughly speaking. She's sick at this point and has an awareness that, she dies some years later, 3 years later, I think. But anybody read Chaucer? You ever Brett lit one? You read Chaucer? How much Chaucer did you read? Knight's Tale, Fabio. Like Fabio? Does anybody still read the Retraction? You know what that even is? Okay, it's the last thing that's in there, right? In which he says, You know all those things I wrote? Forget about those except maybe like all the really boring stuff. Like what was I forget, the Parson's Tale. He says, these are the ones you ought to read. As again, it's kind of like, you could say it's having his cake and eating it too, but there's a sense in which we tend to think of Chaucer as really modern, right? I mean, he has this kind of modern comic sensibilities, kind of sexual frankness, blah, 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 character, details, okay, fine. The Retraction, you read it, and if you take it seriously, I think scholars would say it's not a joke. Chaucer is a person of his age, full of contradictions perhaps, or struggling, you might say, against the ideological boundaries of his age. And Bradstreet does that too. But at the end of his career and at the end of her career, you might say they find comfort in the doctrinaire and the ideological. So I would suggest to you that we ought to read As Weary Pilgrim not ironically, but think of it again as an indication, part of the contradictory nature of Bradstreet, that in fact she is a person who belongs to Puritan America, who is wholly a part of that whole idea of religious instruction and religious belief that Bradstreet, Winthrop, Rowlandson, Hutchinson all belong to. She is not completely out of it. She has her moments where she's exploring other things, pushing the ideological boundaries. At the end of her career, when she's sick, where does she turn for comfort? Precisely the idea of Christ as your bridegroom, right, of the everlasting life. So just something to bear in mind. I think it's a wonderful poem, actually. Which leaves us just a few minutes for Taylor. So we'll probably do a little more Taylor next time, because he's so cool. English metaphysical poetry? Anybody read that stuff? Yes? So what do we know about English metaphysical poetry? Who blamed them really severely? There's one really famous critic in the English tradition who wrote a famous essay on metaphysical poets. Tell me you read. How many of you have taken Brit Lit? Okay, what Brit Lit would you do it in? It's got to be one still. Well, maybe not. Maybe it gets caught in the split. Where do you guys do? Where do you read Donne? In one. Do you read Johnson when you read Brit Lit? When you read Donne in Brit Lit 1? The phrase, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Does that ring a bell? So, Johnson writes in The Life of Cowley. God, you all should read this. It's in The Life of Cowley. Maybe you read it when you get to Johnson. But it would be really more effective to read it with Donne. He talks about wit, metaphysical wit, right? And he talks about what they do, the trick behind the metaphysical poets, is to try to represent what hasn't been represented before. So it's the Metonic project, sort of, but through really weird images. And they call that wit. And it's the bringing together of things that you wouldn't associate together. You put them together and you think, wow, that's a kind of new thing. Except Johnson says that's not doing anything new. It's just perverse most of the time. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. And he thinks that's one of the, he likens Shakespeare's use of puns to that. So he loves Shakespeare, but he says, Shakespeare just never met a pun he didn't like, and he just writes too many of them, and it kind of distracts from him. So here's a famous one. You guys read this one? A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. This is a poem that's ostensibly about, chaste love. But let's look at it. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, now his breath goes, and some say no, so let us melt. Typical metaphysical. Make an as, therefore so, make the comparison. It's kind of a simile structure there. And make no noise, no tear floods, nor side tempests move, 'twere profanations of our joys to tell the laity of our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull, sublunary lovers' love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit. What does sublunary lovers' love mean? What's sublunary? Not a word you've ever said in your life unless you've read this poem. Something under the moon, right? So it's earthly love. We might call this periphrasis, right? Wordiness or finding, again, my favorite one from the 18th century is Joseph Warton writing about fish, the finny tribe. The finny tribe. Sublunary lovers' love, whose soul is sense cannot admit of absence, cause it doth remove the thing which alimented it. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, enter assured of the mind, careless eyes, lips, and hands to miss. And here we go. This is the one that everybody remembers. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion like good gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, our two souls, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And I screw that up. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it and grows erect, and there's no pun there, as that comes home. All right, maybe there's a pun there. I mean, Donne is famous for playing, kind of lacing his poems with kind of frank sexual imagery. Of course, just talking about Christly love, no, just chaste love, no problem. Faithfulness, fidelity. But the whole idea of the lovers as the compass is a very famous metaphysical image, right? And that's the trick of Taylor's poetry as well. So Taylor ought to be read within this metaphysical tradition. And some of his poems actually exist. I said that they were written out, right? They're in the Yale Library. This is Meditation 38. And you actually can see it dated up here. It's, I think, the 6th of July, 1690. Some of them actually have dates. And again, the thing about Taylor is he's this orthodox Christian guy. He has written the preparatory meditations. So this would be on page 268 of your text as a way of preparing to give a sermon. Ostensibly, right? He writes the poems to help him think about the sermon. So each of the poems takes a piece of text as its it's almost a text that the poem is then going to explicate. But you might say one of the things that he does is he tries to show something about divine grace while fully being aware of the fact that he's using, again, as I said before, this kind of human, therefore unreliable form, which is language. And even if you think if it's reliable, you would say it's still not so easy to use, right? Sometimes there are things that you want to express that you can't just do the Wigglesworth thing and express plainly. You can't even do the Bradstreet thing and have simple. You need funky, weird images and lines that you can't say. And in fact, Taylor's poems are hard to read, in part because the intention seems to be he wants them to be hard to read, because that gets the sense of how difficult it is to have this earthly existence and how you still have to persevere all the way through it. Right? What's metaphysical about him is a funny way in which there's a kind of funny interplay of the metaphorical and the literal. And I'll end with this point, and then we can take it up next time. The literal in which he takes things that were dead metaphors or so familiar from the Bible that when you hear them, they become kind of formulaic. An example would be page 270, Meditation 8. I am the living bread, Christ is the living bread. Okay, we get that. So he asks, what would it mean if we actually thought about Christ as the living bread? That means if I'm going to write about that process, I would think about eating him and chewing him and digesting him. And therefore, even though people want to say that this phrase really means, the seat of tender and sympathetic emotions, in verse 4, in this sad state, God's tender bowels run out streams of grace. Now, okay, fine. It doesn't maybe mean digestion, or doesn't it? I mean, he's talking about eating. That's what he does. Dead metaphor, Christ is the living bread. Let's make it alive by really thinking about it as literally as we possibly can. So you might say that one of the projects that Taylor has is how to use this debased form, language, to talk about something that is wonderful and divine and above language, such as grace. And part of the strategy is going to be how you might find new and interesting ways to talk about the need to be humble, right? So from the very beginning of preparatory meditations, the prologue on 269, Lord, can a crumb of dust the earth outweigh, outmatch all mountains, nay, the crystal sky? Embosom in it the designs that shall display and trace into the boundless deity? Yea, hand a pen whose moisture doth guide o'er eternal glory with a glorious glore. Right away, the project of writing. If its pen had of an angel's quill, and sharpened on a precious stone ground tight, and dipped in liquid gold, and moved by skill in crystal leaves, should golden letters write, it would but blot and blur, yea, jag and jar, unless thou makes the pen and scrivener. That's the project right there of Taylor's poetry. How do we use these things that are earthly without God's guidance? So we'll talk a little bit about that. As you read Edwards for next time, I want you to think about how he has the same problem of language. How do you convey what's divine using human language? And we'll leave it there for now. Thank you.